I never imagined that a single HOA rule could lead to a gun being pointed at my disabled grandmother, but that's exactly where this whole nightmare dragged me straight into the kind of chaos you'd expect from a bad TV drama, not a quiet suburban neighborhood. And when Karen, the queen of laminated authority, shoved my 70-something grandmother off her wheelchair, sending her crashing to the pavement, something inside me broke. That was the moment I knew this wasn't just petty HOA nonsense anymore. This was violence. This was dangerous. And somehow I was right in the middle of it. I've lived in Maple Creek Village long enough to watch two HOA presidents cycle through like confused pigeons who never figured out what direction they were supposed to fly. And then came Karen Hollingsworth, our very own storm in human form, marching through the neighborhood with a clipboard clutched to her chest like it was some kind of sacred artifact. She wasn't just a rule enforcer. She treated the HOA handbook like scripture and herself like a prophet chosen to deliver suburban justice. If your grass grew half an inch too tall, you'd find a $75 violation taped to your door. Pick the wrong light bulb. Congratulations, here's a $50 fine. Walk outside too early in the morning. Boom, pre-dawn presence violation. She even fined a teenager for walking suspiciously fast. I remember thinking, if this is suspicious, what counts as normal? But that was Karen for you. She didn't follow logic. She followed whatever bizarre rules she invented at 3 a.m. while drinking lukewarm herbal tea. But all of that, and I mean all of it, felt like amateur hour compared to what she unleashed next. Karen introduced her masterpiece, the No Wheel Zone Act. According to her, our neighborhood needed to return to a simpler, purer way of moving. Translation: she wanted to ban anything that rolled: scooters, bicycles, wagons, grocery carts, wheelbarrows. One poor dad pushing a stroller got screamed at for parading unapproved equipment. At first, everybody assumed she only meant toys or maybe the delivery guy's dolly. But no. Karen interpreted that rule like she was auditioning for the Supreme Court of bad decisions. And it wasn't until much later, too late, that we realized how far she was willing to enforce it. Around the same time, my grandmother Margaret came to stay with me for a few days. Now she's one of those tough older women who carries the weight of her life like a badge. She survived more nonsense than Karen could spell. The moment she stepped out of the car, she sensed something was off. People walked around stiff as statues. Conversations dropped to whispers. Folks crossed the street to avoid even passing Karen's front lawn. My grandma squinted around, adjusted her glasses, and asked, "Why does everyone look like they're afraid of getting arrested for breathing wrong?" So I explained everything: the paranoia, the fines, the bizarre rules, how Karen patrolled the neighborhood like a malfunctioning security robot with a superiority complex. My grandma listened in that quiet, thoughtful way she has, then shrugged and said she'd seen worse. I thought maybe I was exaggerating, until she saw Karen yelling at a kid for rolling a marble on the sidewalk. My grandma looked at me and muttered, "That woman needs holy water." And honestly, she wasn't wrong. The next morning everything felt calm. Birds were chirping, there was a breeze, and my grandma rolled her wheelchair out onto the porch to enjoy the quiet. Nothing dramatic, just a woman taking in some fresh air. I stayed inside watching a movie, letting her have her moment of peace. I didn't know that within minutes everything would collapse into chaos. It started with voices, loud ones cutting through the sound of the TV. At first I thought maybe a neighbor argument, nothing unusual for a Saturday morning, but then I heard something else: fear. Real fear. The kind that hits your stomach first and sends your heart racing right after. I bolted outside, and what I saw, it still makes my chest tighten whenever I think about it. Karen was standing in front of my grandmother with a gun pointed directly at her face. For a second the world froze. My grandma's hands trembled on the armrests. She looked confused, terrified, and fragile in a way I had never seen before. I yelled something incoherent, just pure panic coming out of me. But before I could reach them, Karen shoved my grandmother hard. The wheelchair tipped. I watched in horror as she fell sideways, crashing onto the pavement. The sound of metal scraping concrete echoed like a scream. Then came her cry, part pain, part shock, and all the blood in my body turned into cold fire. I dropped to my knees beside her, trying to help her sit up. Her arm was scraped and bleeding, her body shaking from the shock. She winced when I touched her shoulder. And while I held her, Karen was still shouting, still clutching that gun like she had any right, any reason to use it. "Wheelchairs are forbidden in this community," she screamed. "You're violating the no-wheel zone." The words were so absurd, so devoid of humanity, it felt like I'd been dropped into a nightmare. Neighbors came out. Some gasped. Some froze. Nobody dared get too close. I could see the horror on their faces, but I could also see fear of crossing Karen, fear of becoming her next target. My hands shook as I called 911. My voice cracked as I explained everything. The operator stayed calm, but I could hear urgency in her tone. Every second dragged long and heavy, like the world was holding its breath. When the police finally arrived, they approached slow and steady. My grandma was lifted onto a stretcher with gentle hands, paramedics whispering reassurance as they checked her injuries. Karen, meanwhile, went from screaming to frozen in place as officers approached her. Even when they took the gun, even when they cuffed her, she kept repeating, "I'm just enforcing the rules," like that was supposed to make any of this okay. I wish I could say I felt strong in that moment, protective, fearless. But the truth, I felt helpless. Sitting beside my grandmother's hospital bed later that night, watching her sleep with bruises spreading across her arms, I felt a kind of guilt that ate at my chest. I kept thinking, should I have stopped Karen sooner? Should I have said something before it got this far? Did I fail her? It's strange how quickly you can turn blame inward, even when you're not the one who did anything wrong. There was a point, maybe the lowest point, where I actually wondered if I'd been overreacting to Karen all along. Maybe I should have just ignored her rules. Maybe confrontation would have made things worse. Maybe this whole awful situation was partly my fault for not pushing back earlier. That thought consumed me for a while, until something happened that snapped me out of it. People started coming forward. One neighbor knocked on my door the next evening. He'd recorded the entire confrontation on his doorbell camera. Another neighbor emailed me copies of complaints they'd filed against Karen, reports the HOA board never acted on because she bullied them too. One woman tearfully admitted she'd been fined 5 times in a single month for unauthorized stroller usage and never dared speak up. Piece by piece, people shared what they'd been too scared to say. They weren't just supporting me, they were finally collectively standing up to her. And for the first time since the incident, I didn't feel alone. I felt steady, determined, ready. When Karen went to trial, it felt like the entire neighborhood packed into that courtroom. She looked nothing like the woman who used to strut around with her clipboard held high. Her hair was messy, her eyes darting around, her confidence drained like someone had pulled a plug on her ego. The prosecutor read out the charges: assault with a deadly weapon, elder abuse, brandishing a firearm, reckless endangerment, and each one felt like a heavy stone being set on the table between us. And then came the video. The sound of my grandmother's wheelchair hitting the pavement echoed through the courtroom speakers. Gasps rippled across the room. Karen closed her eyes. Her shoulders sank. And when the judge asked for her plea, her voice, usually sharp enough to cut metal, came out barely above a whisper. Guilty. There was no argument, no shouting, no blaming anyone, just collapse. The sudden realization that she'd crossed a line she couldn't talk her way out of. The judge sentenced her to 3 years in state prison and ordered her to pay $48,000 in restitution, medical bills, damages, community penalties. Each number felt like a marker symbolizing every reckless choice she'd made that morning. My grandmother squeezed my hand when the verdict was announced. She didn't smile. She didn't celebrate. She just breathed a steady, relieved breath, as if the weight that had been crushing our entire neighborhood had finally lifted. And when they led Karen away, she didn't look at any of us. She just walked out of the courtroom, small and defeated, the door closing behind her, like the final punctuation mark of a sentence she wrote herself. I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel triumphant. I just felt done. Like this long, exhausting chapter had closed exactly where it needed to. Sometimes the people who scream the loudest about rules are the ones who break the most important ones. And sometimes standing up even when you're scared or unsure is the only thing that keeps those people from hurting anyone else.